Hello everybody, today's issue is regarding something that a lot of cars, not necessarily just BMWs, will experience. More often than not, you will have to do an alignment on your car, and if you are like me and you live in an area where your cars rust, well, you're going to experience some difficulty with certain parts not wanting to be able to be adjusted anymore. In my case, the tie rods were pretty much seized up shut. You could take the locking nut off, but you couldn't actually thread in the actual adjustment rod anymore. It was so the adjustment rod was so rusted that you just couldn't actually adjust it, even if the locking nut was undone. And so, well, we ended up having to change out the tie rods. At the same time, I also realized that there was 4 other bolts in the back. They're known as eccentric bolts, and these are responsible for doing the alignments on the back end of the car, and those were also seized up. And so my first instinct was basically, if they're seized, you gotta replace them all. The point of today's video is basically to show you where you should spend your money and where you shouldn't. Because all these components are not exactly the cheapest. So for the tie rods, I ended up paying about $250, I believe, Canadian. And that also included the sway bar links, which I also did another video on. Brand new LEM 40 units. The other thing is that I bought the 4 eccentric bolts, washers, and nuts because mine were seized at the back end. And I was thinking that, hey, I would need these to get the alignment done. Funny enough, I think this is where you can basically save yourself some money, because that was about 200 bucks that I spent that I actually didn't need to. You can avoid replacing the nuts because you're not actually replacing the control arms. If you were replacing the control arms at the same time, I would say, yeah, absolutely go for the new eccentric bolts and washers and all the hardware. But if you're just planning on doing alignment, you don't need eccentric bolts. Because the eccentric bolts are so rusted at the back, you can't thread the nut on the bolt itself. However, you can still spin the bolt around in its spot, and that allows you to still adjust it. Here you can see that the tie rod, other than the fact that it couldn't be adjusted, actually was still in pretty good condition. You could see that it was still holding its position just fine, and it was still doing its job on the ball joint at the end of it. But obviously, if you can't adjust it, it's not really much use to us. This here just demonstrates how much force is actually required to turn this thing. And yeah, there's no way you could do this on the car without extensive modifications that would just damage it anyways. Here you can see we're actually cutting a relief into the tie rod, the old tie rod. And we're doing this for basically 2 reasons. The first reason is to count, generally speaking, how many turns the tie rod was screwed in, so that we can have a general idea of how the alignment should be set up, so it's not super bad, so we can just basically drive it to the alignment shop. And for the second reason is to get the old boot and the clamp off of it. So that we can reuse it for the new thing, because that was not included in the kit that we purchased. And so we cut the relief in, and it finally kind of came free. We sprayed it with some more penetrating oil, and finally it came off. So here you can see just how much rust there is on the actual thread. This basically seeps in and it expands, and so it prevents the actual adjustment rod from moving at all. And yeah, The other thing is over here, so when you're doing tie rods, you actually have to put them together on the car. Here we basically learned the hard way. So we started putting it all together. We put a bunch of grease on it so that it won't happen again with this corrosion stuff. So in case we ever have to line it again, it'll be much easier. It won't be as rusted. And yeah, so you actually don't put this together like we did over here, but we did count anyways how many turns and whatnot to not mess with the alignment too much. Still, in the end, it actually was off quite a bit, and but we still managed to get it to the alignment shop, no problem. There was a bit of corrosion on the steering rack itself, so clean that up with some Scotch-Brite. And here you can see we're basically like barely getting this rod on. It's actually very cumbersome. It looks easy, but it's a very cumbersome process to get that on. And I didn't really show the process of you know, putting it all back together, but you can get the idea from how we took it apart.